Welcome. Welcome to a special program with our special guest of honor, James Carroll, with a program entitled In Search of a Common Humanity. I'm Vita Palladino. I'm the director of the Howard Gotlieb Center. Our mission is to capture history and preserve it. I'm very proud to say that we have the James Carroll Archive, and it is on exhibit in the back of the room. Just talking to Jim, we were discussing how it came about, and it's another one of Howard Gotlieb's early on in Jim's career, lassoing, I would say, lassoing him. And we do these collaboratives and we do programs for our students and the friends of the libraries, the local community, to help enrich the minds of people and to bring out the life of an archive by bringing the person to Boston University. We see the writers and the people that we bring in all the genres, actors and directors and producers, as role models for our students and peers for our faculty. We feel that we bring our work to life when we bring these people to the campus and expose them to the various constituencies. So we're very proud to have James Carroll, and it's a wonderful privilege to do this with the Luce program. And the director of the Luce program, which is a program of scripture and literary arts, is directed by my wonderful colleague, Peter Hawkins. I will let him do the rest of the program.
To welcome James Carroll to Boston University actually means to welcome him back. Fresh from his 1969 ordination as a Roman Catholic priest, he came to BU when he was 26 and served this community as chaplain until 1974. Now, those of us who are of a certain age remember the tumult, the excitement, the mess of those Vietnam years, when everything seemed up for grabs and everything mattered. We all have our stories, but just imagine what it must have been like for him. A Georgetown ROTC Cadet of the Year, 1960, nurtured in a devout military family, to discover himself at passionate odds with the war. To be an altar boy raised on and in the Latin Mass, becoming a vernacular priest within an American culture that was pulling apart at the seams, and with a vehemence that makes our own red state, blue state divisions seem like squabbles. When James Carroll left the Roman Catholic chaplaincy at BU in 1974, he also ended his vocation as a priest. It must have seemed as if he were ending that vocation, but in fact what was happening was a transformation of a calling. The priest became the writer, whose publications, as Vita has just told you, and papers are in the Howard Gotlieb Archival Research Center, right here and now at BU. You can see them, or at least some of them, at the bottom of this room. We're collecting him now in the place where this passionate man behind the altar and in the pulpit got his public start. And what an extraordinary career in words it has been. 10 novels, poems and plays, a memoir that won the National Book Award for nonfiction in 1966. That's An American Requiem, God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us. And that almost 800-word monument of research and reflection that is Constantine's Sword, The Church and the Jews, A History. His more recent work reveals the extent to which the concerns that drove him during his BU years, religion and politics, the crises in church and state, a disastrous war, have all continued to drive him ever since. I'm thinking of his 2002 response to the clergy sex abuse scandal with its epicenter here in our town, a book called Toward a New Catholic Church, The Promise of Reform. I'm thinking of the 2004 publication Crusade, Chronicles of an Unjust War, as well as of the work that was published just this year called House of War, the Pentagon, and the Disastrous Rise of American Power. But perhaps more influential than any of these books is the Boston Globe column, which since 2002 arrives on our doorsteps or on our computer screens every Monday morning. Those tidy essays, between 500 and 700 words, that provide for many people what they simply do not find coming out of any weekend pulpit. Hard truth, uncomfortable words, the conviction that self-delusion often hides within piety, the call to genuine and painful repentance. Does anyone else in American letters speak that way? Not that I know of. There's a passage toward the beginning of the opening chapter of Constantine's Sword where Carroll not only tells his readers how he came to write that book about the church and the Jews, but also, I think, about how he understands his own vocation. Let me quote it. I went to Auschwitz as a writer working on a magazine article. I'm a novelist and an essayist, and in presuming to relate a history that culminates at the cross at Auschwitz, I do so with an eye to details and connections that a historian might omit, or that a scholar might dismiss. I'm looking for turns in the story in which one impulse overrode another, one character reversed the action of another, all with unanticipated, ever graver consequences. And if I am a professional writer, it's not irrelevant to my purpose that I am an amateur Catholic. A Catholic, that is, holding to faith out of love. Yet love for the church can look like grief, even anger. Nevertheless, my intensity of feeling is itself what has brought me here, to Auschwitz, to the history of the church and the Jews. So my life as a storyteller and my faith as a Catholic qualify me to detect essential matters in history that a more detached academic examination, whatever its virtues, might miss. There it is, I think, in a nutshell. Portrait of the artist as an attached man. An attached man unafraid to take on over 2,000 years of a terrible history through the entryway of his own experience. He's a storyteller, a memoirist, who's a hunter-gatherer of details and connections, who finds ways to move the heart as well as to make the point. He's a passionate Catholic who holds onto faith out of love, but always aware that true love can never be blind or self-indulgent, but must be brave enough to tell the truth, to be open with grief and anger, to show a willingness to change. And as one of the many who count on James Carroll come Monday morning to help me to begin the week detecting essential matters, and in ways that I simply would not do without his weekly challenge, it's my privilege to invite all of you to follow him this evening in search of a common humanity. James Carroll.
Peter, thank you so much for that introduction. What a moving welcome back to Boston University. When I was that newly ordained Catholic priest many years ago, my life changed because I came here to this campus. Here, perhaps more than anywhere else in my life, I learned what it is to, in the title that Vita Palladino suggested to me for these remarks, search for a common humanity. I am profoundly honored to be back here at BU. When I recall the heartfelt and generous welcome that he gave me those 37 years ago, I realized that no one embodied that noble search more than Howard Gotlieb. Not even Vita, who knows everything, knows the full dimension of my experience of Howard here at BU. Common humanity, friendship. Howard immediately offered his friendship to me. I take special pleasure in thinking of his delight as he impishly and somewhat daringly ushered me into the faculty club for lunch. This in a time when I was widely assumed, even known to be a keeper of what around BU was regarded as bad company. Howard kept bad company too, mine. Having been one of the first to welcome me as a priest, Howard was then one of the very first to welcome me as a writer, declaring me collectible. My mother loved collectibles. She never thought of me as collectible. Howard did. Howard's early affirmation of my work, together with yours, Vita, meant more to me than I can say. And so I want to dedicate my modest remarks tonight to Howard's memory. And I want to thank you, Vita, for your ongoing affirmation and for having me here tonight. I remember the first time I met President Silber, not long after he came here to BU. His question to me, his only question, was characteristically direct. Do I pay you? No, Dr. Silber. Cardinal Cushing pays me. Cardinal Cushing, my boss. Like so many in Boston, I loved him. Cardinal Cushing was a man of open mind and open heart, a true searcher for common humanity in a time when, well, that was not exactly assumed to be the job of a prince of the church. No salvation outside the church, we used to say. That was the vestigial denial of common humanity that marked my tradition as I came of age. Indeed, it was here in Boston that no salvation outside the church was given its most powerful American expression by a fellow by the name of Father Leonard Feeney. Not all of you, but some of you are old enough to remember Father Leonard Feeney. He preached that dogma quite powerfully on the Boston Common and in publications. He was a national figure. He was a figure in my family life in Northern Virginia through the late 40s into the 1950s. His publication was on the coffee table in our house. Archbishop Cushing, he was Archbishop then challenged Feeney on the point. And he ordered Father Feeney to stop preaching no salvation outside the church. But Feeney had the full weight of Catholic tradition and Catholic dogma on his side. Catholics had been proclaiming no salvation outside the church since Pope Boniface VIII and Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and across half a dozen or more formal and authoritative church councils. Feeney knew, as a Catholic, a Jesuit, that he was right, and he disobeyed Archbishop Cushing. Cushing warned him, and then, to the surprise of all, Cushing excommunicated him. Feeney immediately appealed to Rome, confident, tradition, dogma on his side. And surprise of surprises, this was my own introduction into the world of theological dispute. I remember this. Rome upheld Cushing. And like that, the ancient Catholic belief that contradicted ultimately that common humanity you invited me to speak of was overturned. Here is the question I've found myself asking tonight as I return to this special place, remembering this special man. Why was it Cushing who did this? Why Cushing? I think I know. A son of a blacksmith raised in South Boston, he had a sister who was a token taker for the MTA. Her name was Dolly. Dolly married a fellow named Dick Pearlstein, the son of a haberdasher. With his brother, he took over the work of his father's haberdashery. Great word, haberdasher. As far as I know, Harry Truman was the last person to publicly claim his vocation as a haberdasher. Dick Pearlstein and his brother carried on the work of their father, whose name was Louis. The store is called Louis. That Louis. Dick and his brother, the store being on Boylston Street at that point, used to take their lunchtime walks to the Boston Common, and they often heard the preaching of Father Feeney. On most Sundays, Archbishop Cushing was at Dolly's and Dick's for dinner, and he heard from Dick what Feeney was saying and what it meant to him, a Jew. What the Archbishop knew better than he knew the pronouncements of church councils was, as he might have put it, if I love Dick Pearlstein, then so does God. That's simple. Archbishop Cushing experienced his common humanity with his brother-in-law, and because he did, a pillar of Catholic theology was brought down. No surprise then that with the papacy of Pope John the 23rd, it was John the 23rd, by the way, who named the Archbishop Cardinal. Pius XII would not do that. With the papacy of John the 23rd, and with his Second Vatican Council, Cushing would be a leader of the Catholic Church's search for common humanity with all people everywhere. A search that I argue actually began in a special way with Cushing's Act here in Boston, and that defined my time as a priest and made me proud to work for Cushing as a priest. And that search goes on today in my tradition. We Catholics obviously had a special attachment to Cushing, but everyone in this city regarded the Cardinal as a kind of good neighbor. It was a term he applied to himself. I'm the city's neighbor. Cushing was the best of neighbors, and I hope it's not presumptuous of me in dedicating my remarks to Howard Gotlieb to add Cardinal Cushing to that dedication. It changed my life to be one of his priests, as it changed my life to be a chaplain at BU. And I'm the Catholic I am today because of Cushing. When I was chaplain at BU, I was instructed more formally by the great Roman Catholic theologian Carl Rahner. Capturing something of what defined Cushing, Rahner said, "The West is no longer shut up in itself. It can no longer regard itself simply as the center of culture, with a religion which could appear as the obvious and indeed sole way of honoring God. Today, everybody is the next-door neighbor and spiritual neighbor of everybody else in the world." Rahner wrote those words in the middle of the last century. How much more true are they now in the beginning of this one? This new condition, neighborliness, means that as a world of close neighbors, we are bumping up against one another all the time, like Cushing bumped up against Dick and changed. We are all in the position of such rubbing elbows with people who are not like us, who don't believe what we believe, who come from places that we don't come from. But by virtue of our common humanity, we have to understand not only who they are, but meeting them, we have to understand in a new way who we are. That's the point of the Cushing story. It wasn't just enough to know who Dick Pearlstein was. It was that knowledge that changed who Richard Cushing was. This is a particular characteristic of life in the United States of America. It's one of the reasons we love it. A nation like ours, having welcomed an unending stream of immigrants with their plethora of faiths and traditions, is especially suited for this fundamental re-examination, each of us, of fundamental assumptions. America is especially called, not just to the meeting of unlike with unlike, but then the consequence of the re-examination of each set of assumptions. In America, religiously, culturally, ethnically, and humanly diverse peoples have routinely encountered each other in the mundane neighborhoods of work and school and living and Sunday dinner tables. The testing of assumptions that inevitably follows such encounters is one of the reasons why America is suspect in the eyes of rigidly traditional people. Why don't they like us? Because here, through elbow rubbing, we are prepared to re-examine our most basic assumptions. It is part of what America is. After September 11th, the Islamic presence in America, which frankly for most Americans had been essentially invisible, drew particular attention. The still dominant assumption of the mainly Christian, or as we say when we're being liberal, Judeo-Christian character of this nation was quite efficiently punctured. Americans discovered that there are more Muslims living among them than there are Presbyterians or Episcopalians. There are probably as many Muslims in America. These numbers are inexact estimates. No one really knows for sure, but probably as many Muslims in America as there are Jews. Suddenly, with, on one side, Islam perceived as a religion that sponsors violence, and on the other side, a new feeling in America that God is blessing America's war on terrorism, religious differences became a flashpoint in our nation's life. And the sense of common humanity itself fell into jeopardy in a new way. I wish I were talking about ancient history. It does feel like a long time ago, but it's only day before yesterday. Meanwhile, and I know you know this, I know you know this very well. Meanwhile, across the globe, fundamentalist, or what we call fundamentalist truth claims rooted in various religions, no salvation for you, is what it boils down to. No salvation for you, have been fueling conflicts with ferocious new energy. In the Arab world, in Europe, and especially lately in Russia, there have been virulent outbreaks of the old anti-Semitism, calling to mind the potent warning we have from Hannah Arendt, who warned of the doom that follows from the idea of eternal anti-Semitism. Why this again? As if Jews are permanently fated to play the victim's role. What? But not only that now, as the war on terrorism has unfolded, many, in a similar way, have reduced the idea of Islam, including some Muslims, to an eternal jihad, as if the clash of civilizations, in a phrase associated with Samuel Huntington, but which actually Samuel Huntington takes from Bernard Lewis, as if the clash of civilizations between Islam and the rest of the world is now somehow inevitable. Just as bigoted stereotypes about Jews and their religion were once more released into common discourse, especially focused on Israel, wildly distorted characterizations of Muslim belief and practice have been accepted as fact. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and now the regional conflict involving the Arc of Nations from Egypt to Turkey, with the ferocious center in Iraq, is fueled explosively by religious attitudes. Of course, the irony in all this is that all at once the widely held 20th century idea, how long ago, that religion would grow increasingly irrelevant, which was, of course, the conventional wisdom here among the elites at BU in my time as chaplain, why I valued Howard Gotlieb so much. He did not condescend to me. He was not kind to me. How that assumption that religion would be irrelevant in the future, how now it seems unbelievably naive. The intelligent establishment of BU once, unbelievably naive. The centrality of religion to life on earth, for worse as much as for better, has made itself very clear in this young 21st century. Never has the dark side of religion been made more manifest. Well, perhaps I should qualify that. Almost never. What happens when intense religion and radical politics become intertwined? What territorial compromise is possible among people who claim that their hold on land originates with God? What truce can interrupt Islamic violence if it is held to be sacred, even if suicidal? Regarded across time, what religion is free of such demonic impulses? With numerous mainstream religions challenged from within by their own fundamentalists, and with expressly fundamentalist denominations growing across much of the world, the task of renewing the rational element in religion against fundamentalism, the task, that is, of affirming historically minded and ecumenically disposed religion, have come to have broad importance, far beyond importance only to religious people. The fate of the earth in Jonathan Shell is at stake here. The capacity of each religion to engage in self-criticism and in self-correction has come to be seen not only as an issue for the religion, but for the neighbors of the religious. Neighbors now, whose very lives are at risk by uncriticized and uncorrected attitudes. Every religion, I am suggesting, needs a Cardinal Cushing, or perhaps better, every religion needs a Cardinal Cushing at the dinner table with a Dick Pearlstein. I quoted the Catholic theologian Carl Rahner, his protege, another hero of mine, another person who defined my time here at BU, was the Catholic theologian Hans Kung, who once wrote, "There will be no peace among nations without peace among the religions. But there will be no peace among the religions without dialogue between the religions. But there can be no dialogue between the religions without each religion engaging in fundamental re-examination of its basic assumptions." That is what dialogue does. Dialogue is not tea and crumpets and good manners and me getting to know you. Dialogue is my encounter with you as the precondition of my change of myself. So events, history, what we've been living through, what we are living through now still, have forced a new agenda on the world's religions. How do we correct the foundations of our beliefs when they show themselves to violate the common humanity of all? But how can basic change in religious affirmation be made without undermining the authority of the tradition? We love religion because of the tradition. When I was here at BU, as Peter said, I celebrated the Eucharist in English, a great triumph of us Catholic reformers. The last Latin Mass I celebrated was because Professor Roy Waits sponsored me to celebrate it in the Marsh Chapel as an act of reminder to students that the tradition and the past have value. How can you change your basic beliefs without undermining the tradition? This is an especially grave question, why the Latin Mass seems beautiful to people, to some. Because in a time like ours, change is frighteningly rapid, and religion functions for many of us as the only connection we have with what went before, with what we loved about the past. It seems desperately important to wall off at least this realm of faith from everything else. Let this be one place where I don't have to face the pressures of change. I had critics who would insist of the ways I was disserving the students here at BU by not giving one place where they were not faced with the pressures of change. Such an urge is natural because we can only handle so much uncertainty and so much change. And why can't religion be a place where we don't have to do that, where we don't have to face uncertainty, and we don't have to deal with ambiguity? Why can't religion be that place? Isn't that an impulse we can associate with? Yet, of course, the answer is no, it can't. It's impossible for religion to be that place. It's actually dangerous if religion is that place. The most important experience I had here during my time at BU was my initiation into the just then burgeoning post-Holocaust dialogue between Christians and Jews. In particular, I was edified and instructed by my Hillel colleague, the extraordinary Rabbi Joseph Pollack. It was during one of my summers here that I first visited Jerusalem, and where by now I am privileged to return as a regular participant in a Christian, Jewish, Muslim trialogue at the Shalom Hartman Institute. This three-way encounter has been going on for 9 years now, right through the Intifada, the turmoil in Gaza, and even last summer's Israeli-Hezbollah war, with Palestinian, West Bank Christians and Muslims coming into West Jerusalem to search with North American, European Christians and Jews, Israeli Jews, to search with and for a common humanity. What else? We three traditions, all descended from Abraham, have much in common and much to discuss. But let's face it, isn't it true really that we people of the West are inclined to see the relationship with Islam, perhaps required to see the relationship with Islam as inevitably problematic, perplexing, even dangerous? Hasn't it become mainly a matter of us against them? We know from polling that more and more Americans in the last 3 or 4 years, for example, have hardened in their attitudes toward Muslims. We know that in the world of Islam, the war on terrorism, and certainly this includes the war in Iraq, looks more and more like a holy war coming from the old enemy, a crusade indeed, a crusade against jihad. Ladies and gentlemen, that is, of course, the danger that the world is facing. We are in, perhaps, only the first chapter of it now. I couldn't address Vita's question, common humanity, without returning to this question. And if I draw your attention to it tonight, forgive me if it's obvious. The way in which religion is essential to what's going on for both sides of this divide. Despite the broad assumption of secular people that modernity is the source of conflict, conflict with Islam is still overwhelmingly religious. The present conflict recalls, for example, the religious violence in Ireland. It comes as a big surprise in the secular world, and even among some churchgoers and templegoers, that religion can actually motivate behavior on more than one day a week. It can motivate whole lives. Muslims know this, but so do certain Jews and certain Christians. Islam, the conflict with Islam. Here is a list of current world conflicts, a list I noted first in the work of theologian Jack Miles. Listed in this way, we can grasp the religious character of the depth of the conflict that the world is faced with. Right now, we see Roman Catholics against Muslims in the Philippines, Roman Catholics against Muslims on Timor, Russian Orthodox against Muslims in Chechnya, Maronite and Malachite Catholics against Muslims in Lebanon, Jews against Muslims in Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, Christians of various kinds against Muslims in Sudan, Ethiopian Orthodox against Muslims in Eritrea, Anglicans and Roman Catholics against Muslims in Uganda, Greek Orthodox against Muslims in Cyprus, Serbian Orthodox against Muslims in Bosnia and Kosovo, Roman Catholics against Muslims in Algeria, Anglican and Roman Catholics against Muslims in Nigeria, Hindus against Muslims in Kashmir, Coptic Catholics against Muslims in Egypt, urban populations across Europe against their Muslim minorities. And of course, the broad phenomenon in Europe and the Arab world, the rise of the particularly Muslim version of anti-Semitism, Muslims against Jews. A reflection on this truly disturbing litany can go in several directions. Most obviously to the so-called clash of civilizations. Is this inevitable? Eternal jihad, after all? But a question must arise about the Muslims referred to in this litany. Do they, in fact, constitute a civilization? Is the so-called world of Islam, or house of Islam, in fact, one world? That is the way that most people in the West have been thinking about it. The House of Islam is centrally religious, and it is this question of religion that is before us now. So this is the context in which a Christian must reflect on the question of common humanity today. Vida, what is the relationship among Jews, Christians, and Muslims? What has it been since the Holocaust, that moment of a break in history? And what has it been since 9/11? September 11th, of course, has become the all-purpose justification for the larger war on which the United States has now embarked. The United States, only yesterday, began by treating Islam as an undifferentiated world phenomenon, as if Arabs and Indonesians are the same thing, as if, for God's sakes, Sunnis and Shiites are the same thing. Boy, Mark Twain said wars were how Americans learned geography. Wars are how Americans learn the difference between Sunnis and Shiites. And we have learned the hard way now to differentiate among Muslims. Muslims across the world, meanwhile, and this is truly scary, Muslims across the world, meanwhile, have found cause to go in the opposite direction. Muslims everywhere suddenly, with a reason to affirm the old Islamic suspicion that the West is somehow an enemy. In truth, whether this dangerous new belligerence of the United States evolves into a century of holy war or not depends in some measure on our sophistication about religion. Sophistication about Islam, certainly, but sophistication also about religion as such. And that, from this Christian's point of view, is truly disheartening, because our attitudes about religion are oversimple. Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair said early on that the September 11th attacks were no more a reflection of true Islam than the Crusades were of true Christianity. He said a version of the same thing after the London bombings. The Crusades are not Christianity, the bombings are not Islam. Blair's purpose in saying this was a very good thing. He wanted to head off anti-Muslim prejudice. But the comparison is instructive. We Latin Christians, we Roman Catholics, would love to be able to say that the rampaging fanatics who slaughtered Jews in the Rhineland in 1096 and who in 1099 murderously assaulted Jerusalem, slaughtering Jews and Muslims alike, we would love to say that they were acting in ways that had nothing to do with true Christian belief or practice. But in fact, and this is what must make the Crusades chilling, that holy war was integrally tied to theology. The violence of God, who wills the death of his beloved Son, and integrally tied to liturgy. The sign of the cross, which Crusaders wore on their breasts, and integrally tied to church authority, the Crusader popes. Today, in the post-Enlightenment West, we have religion tied up in a pretty box with ribbons, as if it's one of those purely positive aspects of life. Religion is good, that's all. And we are quick to dismiss negative acts or attitudes that are spawned by religion as not really religious. My work, as Peter told you, has focused in recent years on the long, sad history of church hatred of Jews, including mob violence, but also theologically sanctioned forced conversions, preacher-inspired blood libels, Vatican-endorsed and enforced ghettos, the official racial sanction of blood impurity, and the papacy's own use of anti-Semitism in its campaign against modernism in the 19th century. Here is the rub of the argument I am making. When the Vatican asserts that the Catholic Church, as the bride of Christ, is entirely sinless, Well, that the crimes that may have been committed in the past in the name of the church, crusades, inquisition, and so on, that they were the acts of what the Vatican calls sinful children of the church, but never the church as such. When this goes on, it is a furthering of this deadly refusal to confront the way in which religion as such can prompt in human behavior contradictions of our common humanity. If religion prompts bad behavior, then, so they say, it's not real religion, not religion as such. This lets religion off the hook, and today it is dangerous to do that. And we simply cannot let Islam off the hook in this way. I say that as someone who doesn't let his own tradition off the hook. This means that we cannot deplore the sins of sinful members as the Vatican does, without asking the hard question, as the Vatican does not, about where those sins come from. Hard questions, too, are a mode of searching for common humanity. Were the endless acts of Christian anti-Semitism aberrations, or were they tied directly to the anti-Jewish texts in the New Testament? Were they tied directly to the foundational way the church defined itself against Judaism? Were they tied directly to the totalitarian exercise of power by emperor popes? Were they tied to the traditional Catholic suspicion of dissent? Were they tied to the Vatican's rejection of modernity? If anti-Semitism were an aberration, then an apology for the acts of sinful members would be enough. That is what my strongest Catholic critics accuse me of not appreciating, because I say apology does not end it. If anti-Semitism grew out of core beliefs and core practices, then apology is not enough. Core beliefs and core practices have to change, and that is what I say. Does that make me a Catholic basher? Was Cardinal Cushing a Catholic basher? Unpacking and dismantling a core belief? No more than it makes me a religion basher to say that religion, like everything of the human condition, is ambiguous, partly good and partly bad, partly magnificent and partly deeply wicked. Religion has consoled the grieving, has overcome absurdity with meaning, has enabled major improvements in human life, and it supports still some of the world's greatest works for good. But religion also easily confuses the object of its worship, God, with itself. Religion often prompts human beings to make absolute claims that lead inevitably to absolute disaster. Religion can lead, does lead, is leading to ranking by race and by class and by gender. The univocal claims of monotheists can lead to contempt for human beings who reject them. And the open-endedness of pantheism can undermine the distinctions that are essential to thought. The religious impulse to die for the faith slides all too easily into the impulse to kill for it. So, there is no crime of which Muslims acting as Muslims have been accused that Christians, to cite only one other religion, do not stand accused by history. In nothing is this more clear for us Catholics, than our relationship with Jews. This history teaches us that to be religious first is to be repentant. And so with Islam. Just as some Christians like to draw an absolute line between pure virtue of religion and the bad deeds of sinners who act in its name, some defenders of Islam have trouble seeing that violence is coming out of basic Islamic assumptions. To repeat, the evidence suggests that religion as such is ambiguous, the source of consolation and the source of violence. And this is true of Islam. Islamic attitudes toward God, revelation, tradition, law, prayer, fasting, afterlife, and human responsibility deserve full respect. We should all be grateful for them. They deserve to be known and honored by non-Muslims, which to our shame they are not. Knowledge of the complexities of Islamic history, the glories of convivencia in Iberia, the pluralism of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the diversity of Islamic practice all around the globe. Do we in the West know, for example, that there are more Muslims in India than any other nation? India is the largest democracy in the world, yet we ask if Islam is capable of coping with democracy. Knowledge like this is particularly important as an antidote to the crude stereotyping to which Muslims have long and recently been subjected. The first principle, and we Christians and Jews have learned this from each other, the first principle of interreligious dialogue is that each religion must be defined, or rather must define itself on its own terms. When Jews and Christians sit down, Christians do not tell Jews what they believe. We used to do that all the time. You are the people of the Old Testament, Christians would say, knowing nothing of Talmud. That's over. Jews don't tell Christians what they believe. And so now with Islam. And we have a lot of learning to do. Mohammedanism is the way this religion was referred to not long ago. You remember this. It is a word that Muslims have always deplored because it suggests an impulse to see the prophet as a figure analogous to Christ, when the incarnational center of this religion is not the prophet but the text, the Quran. Very few non-Muslims understand that the denigration of the Quran, as happened, and I'm afraid happens shamefully in U.S. detention camps, is not like denigration of the Bible. It is something far more sacrilegious. Thus, the word Mohammedanism does violence to Islamic belief. It is a British word, a colonial word. It is equally misleading to understand Islam using points of reference that originate outside it. So, for example, fundamentalism, as in Islamic fundamentalism. But fundamentalism is a word that was coined in the 20th century about a certain brand of evangelical Protestantism in America. It is not a word that does any kind of justice to the serious belief of a religious Muslim. And Muslims properly resent that word. It has no reference to the world they live in. And before people of the West ask too glibly of Islam, as Bernard Lewis did in a book title of his, What Went Wrong, we in the West might better ask what we haven't asked fully enough. I learned this from the scholar Said Nasser. What went wrong in Europe? That's the question Muslims want to hear addressed. When Pope Benedict implied that Islam, unlike Christianity, was inherently violent, he might properly have been reminded that it was out of Christian culture, not a Muslim one, that the genocide came. Having said all of that, it is still important to acknowledge that Islam today stands against, at least apparently stands against, much of what is taken for granted and valued in the West. And this is true especially of what seems to be the broad Islamic suspicion of what we call the Enlightenment. Whether one thinks of the currency of anti-Semitic rhetoric, especially among Arab Muslims, or the experience not so long ago of the writer Salman Rushdie, whose problem transcended the Arab world, or even whether one thinks of the terrifying growth in some parts of the Islamic margin of an acceptance, even celebration of suicide murder, or whether one thinks of the litany of conflicts around the world that I recited a minute ago. In all of this, one sees a very disturbing sign of a broad gulf separating the Islamic view and the view of the post-Enlightenment world. And it is not clear, let's admit it, it is not clear that that gulf can be overcome, whether common humanity at this level can be reclaimed. Let's acknowledge the difficulty. These questions are only now beginning to be confronted. We have a century's work ahead of us. Let's keep that view in mind. These questions are only now beginning to be worked out. Less through clash, I hope, than through dialogue. There's the hope. Dialogue is an alternative to clash. And as the surprisingly widespread Christian repudiation of Darwin suggests, Muslims are not the only ones who have rigidly irrational tendencies when it comes to their texts. The repudiation of Darwin by Christians, notice, has been growing. The danger of that clash of civilization will be far less if all of us understand that we are all alike as human beings. Russian Orthodox, Melkite Christians, Jews, Anglicans, Roman Catholics, Coptic Catholics, Muslims, Hindus, people of no faith, people of the faith in science itself. We are all alike in our common humanity. The genius, really, Vita, of your impulse to invite our focus on this question. In nothing more is this true than the fact that our noblest impulses come inevitably intertwined with opposite inclinations that betray them. Our noblest impulses come inevitably intertwined with opposite inclinations that betray them. And that is true of all of us. We religious people must submit to the judgment of history. If that is our broad attitude about ourselves, then it is no offense if we expect such self-critical and reforming impulses of each other. This is especially true at a time when foundational impulses of all kinds, including religious ones, are underwriting self-righteous and triumphalistic contempt for the other. The impulses that do that now threaten the world with mass violence, which means the urgent need for religious and for national religions and nations to re-examine those assumptions in light of what they lead to, and where necessary, to correct them. I'm talking, because of my own personal preoccupation, mainly about religion. But everything I am saying could also be applied to America, whose response now, in some important ways, obvious ways, alas, is too triumphalistic, too self-righteous, too certain of itself, and too violent. Having concluded that this war is wrong and unwinnable, we are now in the process of examining how to extend it, assuming throughout our position of innocence and virtue. We Americans assume a close alliance with God still. We assume God's blessing still. How dare we? All of this is why the search for common humanity matters so much, and why the task within that search of religious self-criticism has become so urgent. Obviously, Islam must engage in such reckoning, and we are properly desperate for signs that Muslim leaders and scholars are beginning to do this. But Muslims will be far more able to engage in this difficult process if they perceive those who have long acted like their enemies doing so as well. Christian self-criticism in relation to anti-Semitism can be a model here for the self-criticism that we Christians must undertake now, especially, is in relationship to Islam. Since the Holocaust, in fact, Christians have begun to confront the truth of our complicity in the anti-Jewish contempt that made the Holocaust possible. But Christianity has done no such thing in confronting its relationship to the anti-Muslim bigotry and violence that have been part of European relationships with Islam since the Crusades. The Crusades were, you recall, nearly a 300-year-long holy war against Islam, bleeding into wars against Jews and dissenting Christians, which is why President Bush's inadvertent but now mythic use of the word crusade swept through the Islamic world like an alarm bell. Alas, Bush defined what he then went on to do. So the need for self-criticism applies to every religion, and it is up to practitioners of each religion to say how. Jewish settlers on the West Bank who invoke divine sanction to claim disputed land have this obligation. Christians who uncritically celebrate the death of Jesus Christ on film without regard to the story's violence or to its character as the source of the oldest slander, Christ killer, have this obligation. And so do Muslims when suicidal murderers act in the name of Allah. Those of us who are religious take on the task of such self-criticism in the presence of the other, not just for political hope or even only for the sake of peace through this terribly threatened century, but because there is simply no other way to fulfill the commandment that binds us, which is at last and only to honor God by loving our neighbors as ourselves. And beyond religion, the search for common humanity is humanity's task, and it must become as common as the hope for peace that beats in every heart in this room tonight, and surely in the world. Thank you.
Mr. Carroll will take questions now. We have microphones, so.
The term jihad has got many different meanings. Could you give us a definition of jihad, say from a historic, a religious, radical military definition, and then your definition, please?
Well, I'm no expert in Arabic, and I wouldn't speak as an expert on Islam. Perhaps there are Muslims present who have an expertise in the language or in the use of that word before I offer my own understanding of it. Anyone? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Would you take the microphone?
Thank you. Linguistically, the word jihad comes from the three-letter source, jahada, which is to strive. So jihad literally means to strive for something in the pure literal sense. But of course, historically, in the context of political wars, it has been associated with with war in itself. Although, of course, in the Quran, there's another term, qital, which would probably be more accurate in referring to military action.
I'm grateful to you for that, putting us on the ground of the authentic meaning of the word.
You're welcome.
I acknowledge that my use of the word in my remarks, and perhaps this is what prompts the question, is more or less in a synonymous way with crusade, the way in which crusade in the culture of the West also means struggle. It means, the crusade in the way in which President Bush used it originally. The immediate explanation from the White House is that he didn't mean it, the word in its military sense. He meant it in its more generic struggle sense. It does have that context, but it's, of course, a word that's rooted in a 300-year-long holy war. And I'm opposing crusade and jihad in that sense. It's not irrelevant that the etymology of the word crusade, of course, is cross, war of the cross. When President Bush used the word crusade, it was translated in the Arabic world, I'm told, in the common Arabic translation of the word crusade, which is the Arabic version of the phrase War of the Cross, which must have sounded a particular note on the Arabic ear that the English ear wasn't hearing very well at the time. President Eisenhower called his memoir of the war in Europe, Crusade in Europe. Billy Graham called his great rallying Christian gatherings crusades. Even today, Billy Graham will bring a crusade to a city. But let's face it, both jihad in its common use and crusade in its common use are pointing to this one aspect of religious impulse that is my subject: violence. How do we achieve peace? The great human question. And the two answers are peace through victory and peace through justice. And peace through victory is the great illusion, because every peace achieved through victory, through military victory, is the precondition of the next struggle, the next crusade, the next jihad. Peace like that is always temporary. And it's a question we could ask about Iraq today. Everyone's question is, how in the world do we bring peace to that beleaguered country or countries, however we talk now about Iraq, that shattered place? How do we bring peace? Is it through victory yet? Or is it through the establishment of some kind of justice? And the tragedy that we're all having to confront is our traditions have again and again invited us to embrace the illusion of victory. And that's no more an Islamic illusion than it is a Christian illusion. And the question confronting Jews since coming into state power in Israel in 1948 is the ways in which it can be a Jewish illusion. And Buddhists and Hindus and others have their versions of this impulse as well. Someone else?
You spoke of the 300-year Holy War, but was not the Holy War 1,000 years long, which began with the Muslim attack on Europe when the Arabs came within the gates of Paris at the Battle of Tours, and 1,000 years later were driven back finally at the gates of Vienna. No one can defend the conduct of the Crusades, but they were, I think, in effect, the one European counterattack in a very long war.
Well, it goes back to the observation Tony Blair made. To the extent that the Crusades come directly out of Christian tradition, we understand it as a Christian holy war, and that's my point. I actually didn't address the question, you're inviting me to address it, of the way in which Islamic militant violence is also coming out of the tradition. I'm suggesting it does in some way. And I'm also suggesting it's up to Muslims to confront the way in which that's been the history. But let's remember that our perceptions of that sweeping Islamic violence that was so stunningly successful from the 8th through the 10th century, in which Islamic-inspired armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and moved to the west and to the north, and in very short order took a huge amount of territory and held much of it for many centuries. You're absolutely right about that. But in our memory of it, we emphasize the religious aspect of it, jihad, a holy war done in the name of Allah, and we de-emphasize the other cultural aspects of it, the ways in which it was a mere image of the tribal movements of warring factions that were at work throughout the known world at the time. So when we think of Genghis Khan sweeping west from the east, we don't think of Genghis Khan's religion particularly. I don't even know that I could tell you what it was. But it was a powerful tribal warfare. The Goths and Visigoths who swept over the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, driving just as powerfully to the south, taking over much of the northern continent of Africa before they were finished. Again, we don't remember that sweeping tribal warfare, warlordism, in religious terms. We do remember the sweep of jihad in expressly religious terms. And is that the main note that we should strike about it? That's a question. Let's but also pay attention to the counter story. When Islamic forces came into Jerusalem, not long after the death of Muhammad in the 8th century, what year did Muhammad die? Anyone? Well, within a few decades of his death, before the turn of that century, Islamic forces were in Jerusalem. And what they did there, the Caliph Omar, imposing his military power on the Christian patriarch, Sepphoris, the Muslims required the Christians to readmit the exiled Jews into the city of Jerusalem. And finding that the Christians had turned the Temple Mount into a dump as an act of desecration that was tied to the Christian rejection of the temple, affirming the new temple, Jesus, Omar required the rescue of the Temple Mount as an act of respect for the religion of Jews and for the place in which Jewish sacrifice had been offered. And the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque that stand on the Temple Mount today have their origins in an Islamic act of respect for the Jewish tradition of Jerusalem. That's part of the story too. The Rock, a powerful book by Kanan Makia, tells it to you. It's denied today by much Arab historiography, and Palestinians don't tell this story much either, but it's also part of the story. We don't pay attention to the many hundreds of years of amity, of cooperation, of coexistence that took place in Iberia under Islamic authority, in which Jews and Christians and Muslims lived. The great exception in Europe lived in cooperation and a spirit of mutual respect, with Jews and Christians and Muslims, even for periods of times, sharing the same structures within which to worship, and so forth. So it's a matter of what history we choose to tell. As a Christian, I'm aware that the Crusade story is well told, but it needs to be unpacked and criticized, and we need to understand the Crusades themselves as a holy war, and we need to look for the counter-story on the other side. Saladin, as a figure only of evil, needs to be corrected by an understanding of what Saladin represented that was also humane. Yes, sir.
One of that bad company that you kept 35 years ago and more, and it's a great pleasure to see you back here again.
Thank you very much.
Many of the things you say are extremely wise and thought-provoking.
I hear a butt coming.
But I'm sure you're well aware of some of your previous remarks just indicated that things are much more complex. Let me just give two examples of what I mean. One a small one and one a very large one.
Yeah.
The recent demonstrations in Beirut against the current government have been portrayed largely as Muslim against Christian. But if you look at those demonstrations, the composition of it, at least a major part of the opposition was led by the forces that support General Aoun, a Christian leader who is in opposition. So this is not just Muslim versus Christian.
That's true.
This is a division on other bases.
That's true.
And I think in many other cases, things are much more complicated than a simple religious division.
That's true.
Now the big example is, while the three so-called people of the book are trying to settle their disputes, as you've discussed, the great issue of our century, I think, is going to be the rise of China. And I've even read that the population of India is going to overtake that of China within a century. So I think in a part of the world which you haven't discussed, the great issues that are going to confront us, the decline of the West, if I can put it in those Speglerian terms, and the rise of Asia will be the phenomenon of this century. And these very complicated issues, I think, have to be taken into account as well as religion. Nationalism, and yes, still tribalism in Africa, for example, are very potent forces which do not necessarily coincide with religion, although the three intermingle and commingle. And I think we have to keep in mind the very complex phenomena we face when we try to look for this common humanity.
I welcome your comment, sir. It's a very helpful comment. Let me just respond by saying, of course, the complexities ahead of us are enormous. Religion is we need to be much more attuned to the power of religion as the factor that inserts itself again and again, especially in possibly troubling ways. The crisis of capitalism that is ahead of us. Is capitalism failing now? As the world divides itself increasingly between a small minority of extremely wealthy people and a vast population of impoverished people. And if that trend continues, with even showing itself in affluent cultures like our own, where the middle class is shrinking and the so-called underclass is growing phenomenally, meanwhile, an increasingly an enrichment of a small minority that's unprecedented in history. This is a crisis of capitalism. If this goes on a global scale and there's nothing checking it, there's no criticism of it, it's not part of our political discourse. In fact, our political discourse is at the mercy of this because that small group of oligarchs, the United States of America is on the threshold of oligarchy. We may kid ourselves we're thinking it's democracy. Our establishment, which has been a glorious part of our tradition, the establishment, the noblesse oblige tradition of American establishment in which the privileged in our country have seen themselves at the service of the nation, that establishment is being replaced by an oligarchy, like a Latin American oligarchy. It's a tradition that's wounded Latin America for a century or more. It's showing up here. And you mentioned China. China, the threat from China is going to be if China doesn't do something to alter this. But the patterns suggesting themselves in Russia and China, as well, is that there's an elite and a quickly enriching oligarchy. And if this pattern continues, what is that massive population going to turn to for meaning and a way of adjusting to its situation and ultimately its hopelessness if we have an economic system that's closed? Religion is a factor. And I would argue that through the 20th century, fundamentalist Islam, I criticized using that word in relation to Islam, but fundamentalist Islam is going to be less of a threat to the peace of the world than fundamentalist Christianity. Because Christianity is growing, fundamentalist, irrational, anti-rational Christianity is growing powerfully among the most impoverished people in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere, increasing signs of it growing in Asia. We have to take on... so shall we talk about global warming while we're at it? Maybe global warming will save us from all of this, you know. But no, my simple point tonight, you know, when I left the priesthood and left BU, 35 years ago, I thought I was going to be I said, Philip kindly referred to my identity as an amateur Catholic. I thought I was going to have a relationship to religion like everybody else. It wasn't going to be that big a deal in my life. And I wasn't going to have to think about it. I believed with everybody, all the other smart people I knew here, that religion would be less and less important, especially in the public realm. Wrong. And it behooves all of us. I include people who are not in the slightest interested in religion as a personal source of meaning. It behooves all of us to get smart about what it is and what's good about religion and why are people drawn to it and what is it about religion that answers fundamental questions that people who have nothing else turn to it, and then how do we help them respond to the creative side of religion, the self-critical side of religion. The thing about the Christian tradition, it's certainly true of the Jewish tradition in our culture, but what I'm so aware of, it was the Christian tradition that enabled us to come out of the superstition and irrationality of the so-called Dark Ages. I mean, Copernicus and Galileo, Copernicus was a priest. Galileo was a believing Catholic. These were seriously religious people. Science itself is a gift. The Western tradition of science is a gift from religion. We have to get smart about, stop thinking of religion and science as polarities. Science depends on it as much as religion does, I believe, overcoming that polarity. Yes, ma'am, there was someone right there. Yes, ma'am, please. They'll send you the microphone.
Oh, okay. Last month, I heard a lecture given by a young man who is the Muslim cleric at Brown University at Andover Newton Theological Seminary. And in discussing his religion, he said Islam was a monotheistic religion, and he looked around his audience, who were mostly Christians and Jews, and said, and you have nothing to worry about if you're a monotheist, but if you aren't, you should die. And when he said that, all I could think of was a Janjaweed killing all those people in Biafra. And it really upset me. Is this really a true outlook?
Well, you'd be hard put to find that in the Quran from everything I've been told. I've never heard it asserted as an item of Islamic doctrine that non-monotheists should die. But what does that point to? Even so, let's not get into it's sort of like the Bible, you can prove everything from the Bible, right? What does it point to? Well, I mean, there's the burden of my remarks this evening are that Islam has some serious reckoning to do with its tradition and its beliefs, and that there is a history of religiously sponsored intolerance and even violence that is tied to central tenets and traditions of Islam. And I'm saying that as someone who's an expert on those aspects of my own tradition. So if you're a Muslim, perhaps the gentleman who, I don't presume to say you're a Muslim, but I honor your superior knowledge of jihad. But if you're a Muslim, you don't need to take offense from what I'm saying, because I'm understanding, and this is the terrible mistake Pope Benedict made. The Pope Benedict spoke about the violence of Islam as if it was different from the violence of Christianity, citing a document that from a source that fell between the Crusades and the Inquisition. So let's not, if there are Muslims here, hear the challenge. There are Jews here, hear the challenge. There are Christians here, hear the challenge. It's not a challenge I exempt myself from at all. I see that we have a time constraint, so perhaps we'll take one more question, and then I'll be happy to continue the conversation informally at this fantastic reception that the Gotlieb folks have arranged for us. Yes, ma'am.
Member of...
It's not quite working. I'm sorry.
Is it fine? Okay.
Violence, when in doubt.
Okay, there
violence.
we go.
Yeah.
I speak as a member of Dick Pearlstein's tribe, and I'm much moved by your speaking of the Hartman Institute, where you say Christians and Jews and Muslims get together and dialogue. This is wonderful. However, Jewish history has shown us that in every generation, we have an enemy to fear as Jewish people. We had somebody speak at the United Nations who is the head of a country, namely Iran, who called for the destruction of another member state, the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And people were quite respectful of these remarks, rather than throwing them out. How do you listen to someone like that and not fear when he says, kill all the Jews, and is building an arsenal to do just that. If you are a member of a people who has experienced this time and time again, where's the dialogue? I mean, what's the point of talking?
Yes. Well, I'm glad to have your comment and remark on the table, even towards the end of our public part of our discussion, because it gives me a chance to return to that subject with you. I referred passingly to the Holocaust as an interruption in history. And of course, it's a defining moment, and it was a revelation, an epiphany, in which the core truth of Western civilization was laid bare, which is that Western civilization, centrally the Christian tradition, centrally the Catholic Church, but not only, defined itself over against the Jewish people. When Constantine became a Christian in the year 312 or so, the Jews and the Christians were more or less equivalent minorities in the Roman Empire, more or less the same population. Jews had superior social standing, had more respect from the Roman tradition. If other factors hadn't intervened, just projecting demographics, leaving proselytizing aside, if other factors hadn't intervened, we would expect today that there would be somewhere between 300 and 400 million Jews in the world. There are 2 billion Christians, both having begun as less than 10% of the Roman Empire. There are, as you know, 15 million or so Jews in the world. 15 million, not 2 billion. And it isn't just the events of the 20th century that account for that. The war against the Jews is 2,000 years long. And Jews have a right. I speak, obviously, as a non-Jew. Jews have a right to be wary. And when anyone says the destruction of Israel is a legitimate goal, then you're absolutely right. That's a line that must not be crossed. It's a statement that must be denounced in every possible way. The Holocaust succeeded. Its goal was to eliminate Jews from Europe. And eliminating Jews from Europe is effectively what happened. There are Jewish recoveries in some communities, small, significant, precious. But Jews today live in Israel or the United States. The United States alliance with Israel is one of our noblest traditions. Standing with Israel is one of the most important things this country has done and must continue to do. And we say that without any blinking from the necessity to criticize Israel as we criticize America. Every nation can make mistakes, and those of us who love America are grievously wounded when our nation makes terrible mistakes. And I know that Jews feel that way about Israel. But that's not the ground of our commitment. Must always be clear, standing with Israel. Not because of a Jewish lobby, which is another reiteration of an ancient impulse to detect and exaggerate the ways in which Jews exercise power, as if we're in war in the Middle East because of the Jewish lobby and not, say, because of oil, and so forth. Having said all of that, let me just say that Christians have a special obligation to understand that the survival of the Jewish people is an absolute value. And that's why the fate of Israel matters so much. And it's an obligation not only rooted in our knowledge of history, what we Christians did to make Jewish survival so precarious, but also because of, and now I speak religiously, because we Christians believe, that the Jewish people have a special place in the plan of God. Many Jews don't believe that, but as a believing Christian, I do, and that's part of the story too. Well, obviously, I came before you this evening and put on the table some difficult questions, some questions that cry out for complexity, hoping not to oversimplify, but taking your invitation seriously, Vita, to consider the situation we're in as human beings, and especially as Americans. We're a nation at war, and we're stuck in this tragic war, and it matters infinitely how we muster the wisdom and courage to end it as quickly and as humanely as we can. I acknowledge the decision every one of you made to come here tonight. I'm grateful for it. You've honored me. I like to think that together we've honored the memory of Howard Gotlieb, who has done such a magnificent thing for the future of our culture by gathering the mundane and the treasured objects of a whole range of human beings, some of whom are great heroes and celebrities, and many of whom, like myself, are laborers in the vineyard, one way or another. I end by acknowledging again the honor you've paid me, Vita, in this collection and in this invitation. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are copies of Mr. Carroll's 4 most recent books available in the outer lobby from Barnes & Noble, and Mr. Carroll has agreed very kindly to sit in the back and sign those copies for you if you bring them forth to him. So thank you very much, and the reception has begun.